21 men sat in a courtroom dock, their once pristine uniforms stripped of insignia, their faces gaunt from months of captivity. Among them, Hermann Göring, the man who once commanded the Luftwaffe and stood as Hitler's designated successor, nervously fingered a smuggled cyanide capsule hidden in his cell, knowing he had just hours left before the hangman's noose would claim him. But here's what history doesn't often tell you. In that same courtroom sat a Jewish refugee translator who had fled Germany just years earlier, now holding the power to determine whether these architects of genocide would live or die through the precision of his translations. This is not just a story of justice. It's the moment when humanity itself went on trial, and the verdict would forever change how we prosecute evil. Before we dive into this unprecedented reckoning, I need to ask you something. If you believe the world needs to remember these lessons, that evil thrives when good people stay silent, then please, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe now, because what you're about to witness isn't just history, it's a warning that echoes into our present day. Your share might be the reason someone finally understands why never again must mean never again. The morning of November 20th, 1945, dawned gray and cold over Nuremberg, a city that lay in ruins like a broken testament to Nazi ambition. The Palace of Justice, one of the few buildings left standing, had been chosen with deliberate irony. Here, in the very city where Hitler had staged his greatest rallies and proclaimed his racial laws, his closest associates would face the world's judgment. Inside courtroom 600, freshly renovated and reinforced with bulletproof glass, the atmosphere crackled with unprecedented tension. This wasn't merely a trial, it was civilization's attempt to codify a new form of justice. For the first time in human history, individuals would be held personally accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity, legal concepts that were being defined even as the trial proceeded. The defendants filed in under heavy guard. Hermann Göring led the procession, his once corpulent frame reduced by prison rations, but his arrogance intact. Behind him came Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, whose wild eyes and erratic behavior had already sparked debates about his sanity. Wilhelm Keitel, the Wehrmacht's chief of staff, who had signed countless criminal orders, maintained his military bearing despite his shackles. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, clutched a Bible he had recently embraced in prison. Julius Streicher, publisher of the virulent anti-Semitic Der Stürmer newspaper, muttered under his breath about Jewish conspiracies even now. The prosecution team, led by United States Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, had spent months preparing what many considered an impossible case. How do you prosecute men for following orders that were legal under their own nation's laws? How do you prove conspiracy when the conspirators controlled an entire state apparatus? Jackson knew that failure here wouldn't just free these men, it would establish a precedent that might shield future perpetrators of genocide. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating, Jackson began his opening statement, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. The gallery above was packed with journalists from around the world, their typewriters creating a constant percussion as they documented every word. Among them sat Rebecca West for The New Yorker, who would later write that she felt she was watching a great machine built to answer the question, how can we prevent this from happening again? But perhaps no one in that courtroom carried a heavier burden than the translators. The trial was being conducted in 4 languages, English, French, Russian, and German, with simultaneous translation, a technical feat never before attempted at this scale. Among these translators sat several Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution. Now, they had to convey, with perfect accuracy and emotional detachment, the very words of men who had orchestrated their people's near extinction. Siegfried Ramler, one such translator, later recalled the moment he had to translate Göring's casual discussion of the final solution. My hands shook. Here was a man speaking about murdering millions as if discussing a business transaction, but I had to remain neutral, precise. Justice depended on every word being exactly right. The evidence began to mount from day one. The prosecutors had captured intact the Nazis' own meticulous records. They had documented their crimes with bureaucratic thoroughness, never imagining they would lose the war. Film reels showed the liberation of concentration camps, the walking skeletons that had once been human beings, the mass graves, the gas chambers. Several defendants averted their eyes. Hans Frank wept openly, but Göring watched with apparent indifference, occasionally shaking his head as if disagreeing with the interpretation rather than the facts. Colonel Burton Andrews, the commandant of the prison, had instituted suicide prevention measures after Robert Ley, leader of the German Labor Front, had hanged himself in his cell before the trial began. Guards checked on prisoners every half hour. Shaving was supervised. Eating utensils were counted after every meal. Yet Andrews couldn't shake the feeling that Göring, the most prominent defendant, was planning something. The defendants had been carefully arranged in the dock, according to their importance in the Nazi hierarchy. This visual representation of the fallen Reich created a powerful image. These men who had once commanded armies and ordered executions now sat powerless, their fate in the hands of international justice. Wilhelm Keitel's defense attorney, Otto Nelte, faced an impossible task. His client had signed the Commissar order, directing that captured Soviet political officers be shot without trial. He had signed the Night and Fog Decree, under which suspected resistance members vanished without trace. How could one defend such actions? The Soviet prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, brought a different perspective to the proceedings. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people in the war. Entire regions had been depopulated. When he spoke of Nazi crimes, his voice carried the weight of unprecedented national trauma. Yet even he had to navigate carefully around Stalin's own atrocities, including the Katyn massacre, which the Soviets still blamed on the Germans despite mounting evidence to the contrary. As the first day drew to a close, the weight of what was unfolding became apparent to all present. This wasn't just about punishing defeated enemies. The trial was establishing principles that would govern international relations for generations to come. The concept that following orders was not a valid defense for committing atrocities. The idea that aggressive war itself was a crime. The notion that certain acts were so heinous they constituted crimes against all humanity. Outside the courthouse, Nuremberg lay in ruins that served as a constant reminder of where Nazi ideology led. The medieval city, once one of Europe's jewels, had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Citizens picked through the debris, searching for food and fuel as winter approached. Many Germans, struggling to survive, resented the resources being devoted to trying men they increasingly saw as symbols of a past they wanted to forget. 3 weeks into the trial, the prosecution unveiled its most devastating weapon, the Nazis' own films. On November 29, 1945, the lights dimmed in courtroom 600, and for the first time, the world would see systematic documentation of the Holocaust, compiled into a single, undeniable narrative. The film, titled Nazi Concentration Camps, had been assembled from footage shot by Allied forces as they liberated the camps. George Stevens, the Hollywood director serving with the U.S. Army, had overseen much of the filming. He insisted on using color film wherever possible, knowing that black and white might allow future deniers to claim the footage was staged or exaggerated. As the projector whirred to life, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The screen showed Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, names that would become synonymous with humanity's capacity for evil. Bulldozers pushed mountains of skeletal bodies into mass graves. Survivors, barely recognizable as human beings, stared at the camera with hollow eyes. Children's shoes piled stories high. The crematoria, still containing partially burned bodies when the liberators arrived. In the dock, the defendants' reactions varied dramatically. Hans Frank clutched his Bible and prayed audibly. Walther Funk, former president of the Reichsbank, vomited. Hjalmar Schacht, the economic mastermind who had helped Hitler rise to power, turned his back to the screen. But it was Göring's reaction that drew the most attention. He appeared to be taking notes, as if critiquing the presentation rather than confronting its content. The prosecutors had deliberately chosen to show this film early in the trial, knowing it would color everything that came after. No matter what legal arguments the defense might make, those images would remain burned into the consciousness of everyone present. The next day, something remarkable happened. Wilhelm Keitel's lawyer requested a private meeting with the prosecution. He wanted to know if there was any possibility of his client changing his plea. The films had shattered whatever mental barriers Keitel had erected between his actions and their consequences. But Jackson was firm. The trial would proceed as planned. This was about more than individual guilt or innocence. It was about creating a historical record that could never be denied or diminished. Think about this for a moment. If you were in that courtroom watching those films, knowing that the men responsible sat just feet away, could you maintain the composure necessary for justice rather than revenge? What does it say about humanity that we chose law over lynching? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on whether true justice is ever possible after such incomprehensible evil. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier took the stand on January 28, 1946. A French resistance member who had survived Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. She spoke with a clarity that cut through the legal jargon and bureaucratic euphemisms. She described the selection process at Auschwitz, where SS doctors decided with a gesture who would work and who would die immediately. She spoke of the orchestras that played while people marched to the gas chambers, the medical experiments, the systematic starvation. One night, she testified, we were awakened by terrible cries. The next day we learned that the night before, the gas supply having run out, children had been thrown alive into the furnaces. Even the judges struggled to maintain composure. Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, the British judge presiding over the tribunal, called for a recess. In the defendant's dock, several men wept, but Göring continued to take notes, occasionally whispering to his lawyer, Otto Stammer. The defense strategy began to emerge as each defendant's lawyers presented their cases. They would not deny the Holocaust had occurred. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they would claim their clients either didn't know the full extent of the crimes or were merely following orders in a totalitarian state where refusal meant death. This defense particularly infuriated the Soviet prosecutors. They knew firsthand what resistance meant under a totalitarian regime. Yet Soviet citizens had still formed partisan groups, had still resisted. The idea that these men, who had helped create and maintain the Nazi system, were somehow its victims was obscene. Dr. Douglas Kelly, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate the defendants, found himself drawn into increasingly complex conversations with them. Göring, in particular, fascinated him. Here was a man of obvious intelligence who showed no remorse for his actions. During one session, Göring told him, "I regret nothing. If I had to do it over again, I would do exactly the same thing. The only thing I regret is that we lost." Yet Kelly noticed cracks in Göring's facade. The former Reichsmarshal was desperate to be remembered as a soldier, not a murderer. He spent hours crafting his testimony, determined to use the trial as a platform to justify the Nazi regime to history. He saw himself as defending not just his own actions, but the honor of Germany itself. Rudolf Hess presented a different challenge. His apparent mental instability, he claimed to have amnesia about large portions of his life, raised questions about his fitness to stand trial. But then, in a dramatic moment, he announced to the court that his amnesia had been simulated. "My memory is again in order," he declared, throwing his defense team into chaos. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later armaments minister, chose a radically different approach. Alone among the defendants, he accepted responsibility for the regime's crimes, though he claimed ignorance of the Holocaust's specifics. His apparent contrition divided observers. Some saw it as genuine, others suspected it was calculated to save his life. The testimony of Rudolf Hess, commandant of Auschwitz, delivered on April 15, 1946, provided perhaps the trial's most chilling moment. In a matter-of-fact tone, he confirmed that approximately 2.5 million people had been murdered at Auschwitz during his tenure. He described the efficiency improvements he had made to the killing process, speaking of human beings as if they were units in a production problem. "We knew that the people were to be exterminated," he testified, "but we were told that the Jews were the enemies of the state and that we had to obey orders." By March 1946, as spring began to thaw the rubble-strewn streets of Nuremberg, the trial entered its most psychologically intense phase. The defense would now present its case, and the world would hear these architects of genocide attempt to explain themselves. Hermann Göring took the stand on March 13th, and for 4 days, he commanded the courtroom with a performance that horrified and mesmerized observers in equal measure. Dressed in a simple gray uniform, stripped of all decorations, he had lost nearly 60 pounds since his capture, and his mind, freed from morphine addiction, was sharp as ever. "I was not a party to the decision to go to war," Göring declared, his voice resonating with the authority he once wielded. "But once war came, I did everything in my power to win it. That is not a crime. That is duty." Jackson, who had waited months for this moment, found himself initially outmaneuvered. Göring had spent his imprisonment studying the prosecution's tactics, and he deflected questions with lengthy speeches about German history, the Treaty of Versailles, and the threat of communism. He painted himself as a patriot who had served his country, no different from Churchill or Roosevelt. The translation booth became a battlefield of its own. Göring, who understood English perfectly, would sometimes interrupt to correct translations, using these moments to break Jackson's rhythm. He knew that his real audience wasn't the judges, but history itself, and he was determined to present National Socialism as a legitimate response to Germany's post-World War I humiliation. On the second day, Jackson tried a different approach, focusing on specific documents. He produced Göring's signature on orders establishing concentration camps, on decrees confiscating Jewish property, on directives for the final solution to the Jewish question. "These were necessary security measures," Göring responded smoothly. "Every nation at war takes measures to protect itself from internal enemies." "Including the murder of 6 million Jews?" Jackson shot back. "I knew nothing of mass murder," Göring insisted. "Concentration camps, yes. Security measures, yes. But systematic extermination? That was Himmler's domain." The gallery erupted in disgusted murmurs. Telford Taylor, one of Jackson's assistants, later wrote that this was the moment he understood evil, not as something dramatic or obvious, but as a bland denial of reality, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, the British Deputy Chief Prosecutor, took over the cross-examination with a different strategy. Rather than allowing Göring to make speeches, he rapid-fired specific questions about documents, forcing yes or no answers. He produced the transcript of the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution was coordinated. He showed orders for the execution of Allied airmen, signed by Göring himself. Slowly, methodically, Maxwell Fyfe dismantled Göring's carefully constructed defense. The Reichsmarshal's composure began to crack. When confronted with a document showing he had ordered the complete solution of the Jewish question, he could only stammer that the translation must be wrong. Meanwhile, in his cell, Göring was growing increasingly desperate. He confided to Gustave Gilbert, the prison psychologist, that he knew he would be hanged. "But they'll never hang Hermann Göring," he said cryptically. Gilbert reported this to Colonel Andrews, who ordered even stricter surveillance. Yet somehow, Göring had already obtained the cyanide capsule that he would later use to cheat the hangman. The other defendants watched Göring's performance with mixed emotions. Some, like Baldur von Schirach, the former Hitler youth leader, were disgusted by his lack of remorse. Schirach had undergone something of a transformation in prison, acknowledging that he had educated a generation in hatred. His testimony included a stunning admission. "I put the poison of anti-Semitism into the minds of children." Albert Speer's testimony in June created the trial's most divisive moment among the defendants. Not only did he accept responsibility for the regime's crimes, but he also revealed a stunning secret. In the war's final months, he had planned to assassinate Hitler by introducing poison gas into the Führer's bunker ventilation system. "You betrayed the Führer." Karl Donitz, who had briefly succeeded Hitler, hissed at Speer during a recess. The defendants' lunchroom erupted in arguments, with some calling Speer a traitor and others quietly admitting he might be the smartest of them all. Speer's architect colleague, Hermann Giesler, who was testifying as a witness, provided unexpected insight into Hitler's mindset. He described the elaborate architectural models Hitler had commissioned for the rebuilding of German cities after the war, a reimagined Berlin that would be the world's capital, with buildings designed to be impressive even as ruins thousands of years hence. Even as Germany burned, Hitler was planning for a millennium that would never come. The testimony of SS Obergruppenführer Erich von Dambach-Zalewski provided another shocking moment. A man responsible for anti-partisan warfare that killed hundreds of thousands. He appeared as a prosecution witness, trading testimony for immunity. He confirmed that the war against the Soviet Union had been designed from the beginning as a war of extermination. "Did you participate in the execution of Jews?" he was asked. Yes, he replied simply. We all did. It was understood that this was part of the greater plan. Several defendants visibly recoiled from Boczylewski, not from moral disgust, but from contempt that he would betray what they still saw as soldiers' honor by testifying against former comrades. Julius Streicher's defense was perhaps the most bizarre. The publisher of Der Stürmer, whose anti-Semitic propaganda had been so virulent that even other Nazis found it excessive, claimed he was merely a journalist exercising free speech. His lawyer, Hans Marx, faced an impossible task. How do you defend a man whose newspaper had called for the extermination of Jews years before it became state policy? Streicher's testimony devolved into anti-Semitic rants, so extreme that Judge Lawrence repeatedly had to silence him. At one point, Streicher claimed that the prosecution itself was a Jewish conspiracy, pointing at prosecutors and identifying which ones he believed were Jewish. Even his co-defendants were embarrassed. Göring was overhead saying, "That man made us all look like fools." The question of following orders versus personal responsibility reached its apex during Wilhelm Keitel's testimony. The former chief of the Wehrmacht High Command had signed every criminal order Hitler had issued to the military. His defense was simple: a soldier obeys. Even illegal orders? Maxwell Fyfe pressed. In the German military tradition, an order from the supreme commander is law, Keitel responded. So if Hitler had ordered you to shoot your own mother? Keitel paused, his military bearing finally cracking. I would have found a way to avoid such an order. But you found no way to avoid orders to murder millions of Soviet prisoners of war. Keitel had no answer. As summer gave way to autumn in 1946, the Nuremberg trial entered its final phase. The defendants would make their last statements, the judges would deliberate, and the world would learn whether this unprecedented experiment in international justice would deliver verdicts that could satisfy both law and conscience. The prosecution's closing arguments, delivered over several days in July, wove together the massive amount of evidence into a narrative that was both legally precise and morally devastating. Robert Jackson, having learned from his earlier confrontation with Göring, delivered what many considered the finest speech of his career. These men destroyed free government in Germany and now plead to be excused from responsibility because they became slaves, Jackson declared. They are in the position of the fictional boy who murdered his parents and then pleaded for leniency because he was an orphan. The French prosecutor, François de Menthon, added a philosophical dimension that elevated the proceedings beyond mere criminal justice. He argued that Nazism represented a regression to barbarism, a deliberate rejection of 2,000 years of Christian civilization and Enlightenment values. The defendants weren't just criminals. They were architects of a systematic attempt to reverse human moral progress. But it was the Soviet prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, who perhaps captured the emotional truth most powerfully. When the entire sufferings of the Soviet people are considered, one's mind refuses to grasp the full extent of the monstrous crimes committed by these criminals. Each defendant was granted the opportunity to make a final statement. These last words, they knew, would be their final chance to influence not just their verdicts, but their place in history. Hans Frank, the former Governor-General of Poland, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. Having rediscovered his Catholic faith in prison, he declared, "1,000 years will pass, and still Germany's guilt will not have been erased." His acceptance of responsibility stood in stark contrast to his co-defendants, most of whom maintained their innocence or blamed dead leaders like Hitler and Himmler. Wilhelm Frick, the bureaucrat who had drafted the Nuremberg race laws, claimed he was merely a civil servant implementing government policy. His dry, administrative defense chilled observers more than emotional outbursts might have. Here was the banality of evil personified, genocide reduced to paperwork and procedures. Alfred Rosenberg, the party's chief ideologist, whose racial theories had provided intellectual cover for mass murder, delivered a rambling statement about being misunderstood. He claimed his writings had been purely theoretical, never intended to inspire actual violence. The gallery's bitter laughter forced Judge Lawrence to call for order. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer on trial, maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence that, as head of the Reich Security Main Office, he had overseen the entire concentration camp system. His claims of ignorance were so absurd that even his own lawyer seemed embarrassed. Then came Göring's final statement. Rising to his feet one last time, he delivered what amounted to a Nazi manifesto. "I stand behind the things that I have done. I regret nothing except that we lost the war. The prosecution has painted us as criminals, but we were defending Germany against those who would destroy her." The gallery sat in stunned silence. After all the evidence, after the films and testimony and documents, Göring remained unrepentant. His statement would influence Nazi apologists for generations to come, exactly as he intended. Albert Speer, in contrast, used his final words to warn against the dangers of totalitarianism and blind obedience to authority. "The German people will despise and curse Hitler," he predicted. "The world will learn not only what he did, but what we might have prevented if we had the courage to act." Rudolf Hess delivered perhaps the strangest final statement, a rambling discourse that confirmed many observers' suspicions about his mental state. He spoke of secret Jewish plots, of being poisoned in prison, of prophecies and visions. Even his co-defendants shifted uncomfortably as he spoke. On August 31, 1946, the court adjourned for final deliberations. The judges retreated to consider 403 separate sessions of testimony, 113 witnesses, and thousands of documents. The world waited. Behind closed doors, the deliberations were more complex than the public knew. The judges disagreed on several defendants. Soviet Judge Iona Nikitchenko pushed for all defendants to be executed, seeing the trial's purpose as punishment rather than justice. The American judge, Francis Biddle, argued for careful discrimination between levels of guilt. The French judge, Henri Donadieu de Vabre, worried about the precedent of executing military officers for following orders. The debate over Speer was particularly intense. His acceptance of responsibility and his claim to have planned Hitler's assassination had impressed some judges. But could someone who had used slave labor to keep the German war machine running really claim ignorance of the regime's genocidal nature? Meanwhile, in their cells, the defendants waited. Some, like Keitel, spent their time writing letters to their families, trying to explain actions that defied explanation. Others, like Streicher, ranted to anyone who would listen about the injustice of the proceedings. Göring, however, was making different preparations. Despite the constant surveillance, he had somehow maintained possession of a cyanide capsule. Some historians believe it had been hidden in his cell from the beginning, possibly in a jar of face cream. Others suspect a sympathetic guard. Göring wrote several letters to be delivered after his death, including one to Colonel Andrus that would reveal the capsule's location, a final act of defiance and mockery. Dr. Gilbert, the prison psychologist, conducted final intelligence tests on the defendants during this waiting period. The results were remarkable. Despite their moral monstrosities, most scored well above average intelligence. Hjalmar Schacht and Arthur Seyss-Inquart scored at genius level. Evil, it seemed, was not a function of stupidity, but of choice. On September 30th, 1946, the court reconvened for the verdicts. The courtroom was packed, with journalists from around the world poised to telegraph the results to waiting nations. The defendants filed in for the last time as a group, their faces showing the strain of a month's uncertainty. Judge Lawrence began reading the verdicts at 2:30 p.m. The legal reasoning was meticulous, establishing precedents that would influence international law for generations. The court rejected the defense of superior orders, while acknowledging that it could be considered in mitigation. It affirmed that aggressive war was indeed a crime. Most importantly, it established that individuals, not just nations, could be held accountable for war crimes. One by one, the verdicts were read. Hermann Wilhelm Göring, guilty on all 4 counts. Sentence, death by hanging. Göring's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as he removed his headphones. Rudolf Hess, guilty on counts 1 and 2. Sentence, life imprisonment. Hess seemed not to understand, staring blankly ahead. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty on all 4 counts. Sentence, death by hanging. Hitler's foreign minister collapsed into his chair, his arrogance finally shattered. The verdicts continued. Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sauckel, Jodl, Seyss Inquart, and Martin Bormann, tried in absentia, were sentenced to death. Funk, Raeder, and Donitz received prison sentences. Schacht, Papen, and Fritzsche were acquitted. Verdicts that caused controversy but demonstrated that this was a legal proceeding, not a show trial. Speer received 20 years, a sentence that divided opinion. Some felt his acceptance of responsibility merited leniency. Others believed his use of slave labor deserved death. The 2 weeks between sentencing and execution were perhaps the most psychologically intense period of the entire trial. The condemned men filed appeals, wrote final letters, and confronted their mortality in different ways. The prison chaplain, U.S. Army Major Henry Göring, found himself at the center of extraordinary moral and spiritual dramas. Göring, a Lutheran minister from Missouri, had initially been reluctant to take the assignment. How could he minister to men responsible for such evil? But he came to see his role as essential, not to forgive their crimes, but to offer the possibility of spiritual redemption, even to the worst of humanity. Wilhelm Keitel underwent a remarkable transformation. The man who had signed orders for mass murder now spent his days reading the Bible and writing letters of apology to his son, who was a prisoner of war in Soviet hands. "I have stained the honor of the German soldier," he wrote. "Learn from my mistakes." Hans Frank's conversion seemed genuine to Göring. The former Governor-General of Poland spent hours in prayer and confession. He asked Göring to convey his apologies to the Polish people, knowing they would never accept them, but feeling compelled to try. Julius Streicher, conversely, remained venomous to the end. He accused Göring of being a Jew lover and refused spiritual comfort. His cell was decorated with pornographic drawings he had sketched, mixing sexual and anti-Semitic imagery in ways that disturbed even the hardened guards. Hermann Göring presented the most complex challenge. He attended Göring's services and engaged in theological discussions, but the chaplain sensed it was more intellectual exercise than spiritual awakening. Göring was playing a different game, preparing for what he saw as his final performance. On October 13, 1946, the Allied Control Council rejected all appeals. The executions would proceed on October 16th. Master Sergeant John C. Woods, the official U.S. Army executioner, began preparing the gallows in the prison gymnasium. Woods, who had carried out numerous executions, later claimed he had deliberately made the trapdoor too small and the drop too short to ensure the condemned men suffered. Whether true or not, his preparations were meticulous. The condemned were not told the exact date of their execution, though most guessed it was imminent. They were allowed final visits from family members. Göring met with his wife, Emmy, and daughter, Etta, one last time. Witnesses described him as tender with his daughter, but still maintaining his facade of strength. Alfred Rosenberg's wife had divorced him during the trial, refusing even to visit. He spent his last days writing a political testament that blamed Germany's defeat on betrayal rather than Nazi ideology. Even facing death, he learned nothing. On the evening of October 15th, the condemned ate their last meal. Most barely touched their food. Ribbentrop requested a bottle of wine, but was refused. The prison was locked down, with extra guards posted to prevent any suicide attempts or rescue attempts by die-hard Nazis. At 10:45 p.m., guards noticed Göring appeared to be sleeping unusually soundly. When they entered his cell, they found him dead, foam on his lips, the smell of bitter almonds, cyanide, in the air. He had cheated the hangman. Colonel Andrus was devastated. Despite all precautions, Göring had succeeded in his final act of defiance. An immediate investigation was launched, but the execution schedule proceeded. Later, Göring's letter to Andrus would reveal the capsule had been hidden in a pot of face cream all along, retrieved just hours before his scheduled execution. The remaining executions began at 1 a.m. on October 16th. Ribbentrop was first, walking to the gallows on unsteady legs. His last words were, "God protect Germany. My last wish is that Germany realize its entity and that an understanding be reached between East and West." Keitel followed, maintaining his military bearing to the end. "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers went to their deaths for the fatherland. I follow now my sons, all for Germany." Each execution took approximately 15 minutes from cell to death. The condemned man would be led to the gallows, allowed final words, hooded, noosed, and dropped. Woods's technique was imperfect. Several of the condemned took many minutes to die. strangling slowly rather than having their necks broken instantly. Streicher's execution was particularly dramatic. Defiant to the end, he shouted, "Heil Hitler!" as he mounted the scaffold. His last words were, Purimfest, 1946, a reference to the Jewish holiday commemorating the hanging of Haman, enemy of the Jews in ancient Persia. Even in death, his anti-Semitism defined him. Hans Frank went to his death with apparent peace, thanking the chaplain and expressing hope for God's mercy. Kaltenbrunner maintained his innocence to the end. Wilhelm Frick said simply, "Long live eternal Germany." By 2:45 a.m., it was over. 10 men had been hanged for crimes that defied comprehension. Their bodies were photographed to prove their deaths. The Allies had learned from the conspiracy theories surrounding Hitler's death to document everything. In a final indignity that some saw as justice and others as petty revenge, the bodies were cremated at Dachau concentration camp, and the ashes scattered in a river. There would be no graves to become shrines for neo-Nazis. The prison sentences began immediately for those spared execution. Hess, Funk, Speer, and the others were transported to Spandau prison in Berlin, where they would serve their time under rotating Allied guards.